Hello everyone. I am Terror Meta, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now, get comfortable and relax. My name is Ethan Wells. I'm 34 years old, and I never imagined that a 5-night retreat into the heart of Caddo Lake would change everything I thought I knew about loss, guilt, and the darkness that hides just beyond the trees. I had recently been through a divorce that left me shattered, and the painful separation from my daughter still echoed in every quiet moment. I thought solitude in the wild, with only my RV and my loyal golden retriever Benji for company, could help me reset my life. I arrived at a secluded spot in Caddo Lake State Park, a place whose eerie beauty had always fascinated me from afar. The park was spread out along the Texas-Louisiana border, known for its haunting cypress swamps draped in Spanish moss and the fog that seemed to breathe secrets of the past. I deliberately chose a spot far from the official campsites, down a narrow, seldom-used dirt road that twisted its way into a dense thicket of mesquite and live oaks. The isolation promised the quiet I craved, a place to journal my thoughts and perhaps find some semblance of inner peace. On the first evening, as dusk crept over the water and the sky turned a blood orange, Benji began to act strangely. Normally, a cheerful companion, he kept a wary eye on the dark woods, occasionally growling at unseen figures. I chalked it up to the natural jitters of a dog in an unfamiliar territory. But deep down, a shiver of unease settled over me. As I set up my tripod for a long exposure shot of the sinking sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as I sipped lukewarm coffee in the dim light of the RV, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from outside. At first, I assumed it was the wind weaving through the trees, but the cadence of the voices seemed distinctly human, fragile, pleading, and somehow familiar. I called out into the darkness, "Hello?" and waited, heart pounding, for an answer. Silence greeted me. I tried to dismiss the sound as a trick of the mind, exacerbated by exhaustion and the isolation of the swamp. The following morning, I found muddy handprints on the side of my RV windows. They were small, almost childlike, and appeared to be pressed onto the metal as if someone had desperately tried to get in. My heart pounded as I stared at them in disbelief. Just outside the door lay a small antique doll, its porcelain face cracked and its clothes soaked and caked with moss. I didn't know what to make of it, an eerie token left behind, or perhaps a warning. That night, I tuned my portable radio in search of a familiar station, but instead, amid the static, I caught a faint, haunting whisper. It was a child's voice, barely audible over the interference, saying, "Don't leave us, Daddy." The words hit me like a blow. Memories of my daughter, her sweet, trusting voice came rushing back, mingled with guilt and sorrow over my failures as a father. I slammed the radio off, shaking off the uncanny resemblance, yet the words echoed in my mind long after the sound had ceased. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, haunted by vivid nightmares. In my dreams, I saw pale, gaunt children, wandering aimlessly through the murky swamp, their eyes hollow, their voices soft and desperate. They called out to me, repeating, "Daddy, Daddy." Each time I awoke, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, the echo of their cries left me more disoriented than before. Over the next couple of days, the forest itself seemed to conspire against me. Trails that I had confidently marked during the Kiwaum daylight would appear altered by dusk. Paths led to dead ends, or to places that were inexplicably unfamiliar. Benji, who had always been my guardian in the dark, became increasingly agitated. His ears would prick up at the slightest sound, and his eyes darted around as if he sensed things I could not see. Once, I followed him as he trotted along a muddy track that led to a copse of trees. There, at the base of an ancient oak, I found another set of small handprints pressed into the dirt, a silent message I couldn't ignore. In the margins of my journal, I began to find notes that I didn't remember writing. Faded scrawls emerged beside my neat handwriting, reading simply, "Stay with us, Daddy." I couldn't tell if it was my own subconscious playing tricks on me or something else entirely. Each morning, as I reread my entries, the words felt increasingly like an invitation, a summons to step deeper into the mystery that lurked in the shadows of the swamp. One humid twilight, after a day filled with uneasy silence and the constant rustle of unseen movements, I heard something that shattered any remnants of rational thought. Benji had disappeared. I called for him through the RV and into the growing dusk, but his usual bark was absent. Hours passed, and the only response was the oppressive, heavy stillness of the swamp. I searched every conceivable hiding spot around the RV, calling his name, my voice trembling with anxiety. When I finally found him, he was back, but visibly shaken. His golden fur was matted with mud, and a deep scratch ran along his side. A wound that looked like it had been inflicted by a desperate claw. That night, as I sat by the small portable heater trying to shake off the day's events, I felt compelled to check my radio once more. With a mix of dread and hope, I powered it up. Static enveloped the cabin until, amid the crackling, I heard the same childlike voice. It was more insistent now, louder than before. "Don't leave us, Daddy." I froze, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Yet the only thing I could grasp was that my isolation was not just physical, but perhaps something far more sinister. Sleep, if it could be called that, finally claimed me in broken fragments. I dreamt of a half-sunken shack hidden deep within the swamp, a place where time seemed to have stopped. In the dream, I wandered barefoot through the soft, wet earth, my only guide a dim flashlight that barely cut through the murk. The shack's door creaked open in the dream, and inside I saw a rocking chair moving on its own, as if rocked by invisible hands. The walls were adorned with old, faded drawings of children and tiny handprints that smeared like the remnants of forgotten memories. And then I heard them, a chorus of small, sorrowful voices calling out, "Daddy," in a pitch that made the sound feel both tender and malevolent. I woke with a start, my heart hammering, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if the nightmare was over or if I had merely crossed a threshold. The oppressive atmosphere of the RV pressed in on me, as if the very air were laden with unseen eyes. I scribbled frantic notes in my journal, my pen trembling, each word a desperate attempt to document the inexplicable. The following evening, driven by a mix of dread and a need to confront my demons, I ventured out on a solo midnight walk with Benji by my side. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the path, and the woods seemed to whisper secrets that were meant to remain hidden. I walked until I reached the edge of the swamp, where the water's surface reflected the skeletal silhouettes of the cypress trees. It was there that I heard it, a soft, plaintive cry, unmistakably like that of a child. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the compulsion to follow that familiar voice. "Mommy? Daddy?" The cries floated on the moist air, and without a second thought, I found myself following them into the heart of the swamp. The ground was treacherous, and I felt the damp, cold mud seeping into my shoes with every step. My flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that danced among the trees. Benji trotted behind me, his hackles raised, as if he, too, sensed the gravity of our errand. The sound led me to a narrow clearing where an old, dilapidated shack sat half-submerged in the water. Its wooden frame was worn, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The air around it was colder, carrying an odor of decay mixed with something faintly sweet, a smell that reminded me of old toys and forgotten dreams. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart pounding in my ears, but the desperate cries urged me forward. Inside, the dim beam of my flashlight revealed walls covered with crude drawings. There were stick figures of children, scrawled in charcoal, their eyes exaggeratedly large and filled with sorrow. Tiny handprints were smeared across the damp wood, each one a silent testimony to a presence that had once longed for attention. In the corner, an old porcelain doll, its face cracked and lifeless, sat atop a rusted metal shelf. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me, and I couldn't help but feel that it was watching, waiting. I stepped further into the shack, every sense on high alert, when suddenly the temperature dropped and a collective shiver ran down my spine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a pale, almost translucent figure slipping past the doorway. I froze, barely daring to breathe. Then I saw them. Small, gaunt children emerging from the shadows, their skin ashen and eyes wide with an unearthly emptiness. They moved slowly, their bare feet leaving faint impressions on the soaked floor. One of them, a little girl with tangled hair, stared directly at me. Her lips parted, and in a voice that was both gentle and chilling, she whispered, "Daddy." My mind reeled. I had followed that voice here, drawn by memories and a longing to hear my daughter's voice once more. But these were not the joyful sounds of a child. They were laden with sorrow, despair, and something altogether otherworldly. I backed away, my pulse racing as I stumbled out of the shack. Behind me, the soft voices began to rise in unison, echoing, through the fog that had started to roll in with an unnatural speed. I returned to the RV in a daze. The image of those spectral children burned into my memory. That night, every shadow seemed to hide a pair of eyes. Every gust of wind carried their faint whispers. Benji barked at the dark, frantic and agitated, and for the first time in days, I felt a deep-seated terror that I could neither shake nor understand. Desperation clawed at me. I decided to burn the antique doll, the one that had appeared mysteriously at my door, and any remnants of the haunting, drawings in the shack. With trembling hands, I retrieved the doll from the RV and piled some old paper and dry wood, setting up a small controlled fire outside the vehicle. As the flames licked the doll's porcelain face, I watched with a mix of dread and relief. But instead of the expected crackle and pop, the fire seemed to stutter, and then a collective shriek, like the anguished cry of 100 lost souls, shattered the stillness of the night. The sound was so raw, so primal, that I staggered backward, nearly dropping my lighter. For a long moment, the flames and the surrounding fog hung suspended in a terrifying stillness. Then, as if released from a spell, the fog began to lift, revealing the dark silhouette of the woods and the shimmering surface of the swamp. I didn't wait to process the sight. I bolted back to the RV, my mind a chaotic jumble of fear and determination. I tried to start the RV's engine, but it sputtered and died, as though the very air around it had conspired to silence me. Panic surged as I fumbled with the keys and controls, but nothing worked. I stepped outside and looked up to see the dense fog parting just enough to reveal faint, ghostly shapes emerging from the trees. They drifted toward the RV, pale, insubstantial figures that seemed to float rather than walk. Benji barked furiously at them, his body trembling as he pressed himself against my leg. Then, amidst the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something that froze my blood. A flash of a familiar face among the spectral forms. It was my daughter's face, twisted in sorrow, her eyes pleading with me. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fear and guilt, or something far more sinister. The figure reached out as if beckoning me to follow, and for a split second, my heart almost surged with a desperate longing to be reunited. But I knew better. I couldn't let myself be lured any further into this nightmare. Clutching the steering wheel, I took a deep breath and forced the RV into motion. The engine roared back to life, and I drove off. The spectral figures swirling in the periphery of my vision. The road twisted and turned through the swamp, and every now and then I caught fleeting glimpses of children's laughter riding the wind, soft, haunting, and unmistakably sorrowful. For what felt like hours, I drove blindly. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring into one endless, oppressive night. I passed by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The radio remained dead, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. At every turn, I felt the weight of unseen eyes, the presence of 1,000 lost souls whispering from just beyond the veil of the tangible world. Eventually, the RV sputtered to a stop on a deserted stretch of road, the engine finally giving, out under the strain of the supernatural forces that seemed to be at work. I sat there, heart pounding, unsure whether to flee on foot or to wait for help that I knew might never come. In that stifling silence, the distant sound of children's voices reached me once again, so soft, so pleading that it tugged at the deepest recesses of my grief-stricken heart. I stepped out of the RV, my legs unsteady, and began to walk along the cracked pavement. The voices grew louder with each step, forming a discordant chorus that was both irresistible and terrifying. I couldn't tell if they were calling to me, guiding me, or warning me to stay away. My mind, clouded by fear and sorrow, forced me to follow them until I reached a small clearing where the remnants of an old building stood, a place that looked all too familiar from my fragmented memories of childhood. There, among the ruins of what once might have been a modest home or a community shelter, I found a tattered photograph pinned to a broken wall. In the image were smiling children, their faces full of life and innocence, a stark contrast to the spectral figures I had encountered earlier. A note scribbled in shaky handwriting was attached. "Remember us." The inscription made my heart ache with an unbearable mix of longing and despair. At that moment, the apparition of my daughter reappeared in my vision, her eyes full of a desperate sadness, her tiny hand reaching out. I wanted to rush to her side, to embrace her and tell her that I was sorry, that I had been trying to fix everything, but I knew, deep down, that this was not my daughter. It was the lost souls of the swamp, childlike specters trapped by their own tragic fates, echoing the cries of a past too painful to forget. In that fleeting moment, I realized that the swamp was not merely a haunted place, it was a living repository of guilt, sorrow, and unresolved grief. The children, with their plaintive cries of "Daddy," were not violent in the physical sense, but their presence was a psychological trap. They fed on the anguish of those who had lost something irreplaceable, using that vulnerability to draw people deeper into their world. They were dangerous in the way that despair can be, slow, insidious, and ultimately all-consuming. I finally managed to flag down a passing car, a kind local who, upon hearing my fractured explanation, offered to drive me back to civilization. As I climbed into the stranger's truck, I caught one last glimpse of the swamp receding into the night, its dark waters and twisted trees a silent testament to the lives lost and the secrets buried beneath. The voices of the children, now distant, continued to echo in my mind, a haunting reminder of what I had experienced. I eventually found refuge in a small motel on the outskirts of town, where I spent the next few days recovering from what felt like a surreal ordeal. I never spoke of that night to anyone. No one would believe the chilling reality of the swamp's haunting. I disposed of the journal entries that had been rewritten with those desperate words, trying to erase the memory of being beckoned by unseen hands. Yet the memories persisted. I could still hear the laughter, the pleading voices, and feel the sorrowful eyes of those spectral children every time I closed my eyes. The scars of that night never truly faded. I left Caddo Lake with Benji, both of us forever changed. I never returned to camping, and the open road lost much of its allure. Even in my new home, far from the haunted bayous of Texas, I would catch moments, a shadow flickering in the corner of my vision, the soft sound of children's voices echoing in the wind, that reminded me of that night. The memory of the little girl's sad eyes and the desperate call of "Daddy" still haunted me, a relentless echo of a past I could never escape. I tried to rebuild my life, to bury the terror beneath layers of routine and the passage of time, But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howled just right and the dark seemed to press against my windows, I would remember that night at Caddo Lake. I'd think of the ruined shack, the antique doll burning in the fire, and the spectral children whose voices blended with my own suppressed guilt. In those moments, I realized that some wounds never heal completely. They fester in the shadows, waiting for a chance to remind you that some losses can never be forgotten. Now, as I write this from the safety of my living room, thousands of miles away from that cursed place, I am still tormented by the knowledge that I narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The swamp claimed its due, not through violent confrontation, but through the slow, deliberate invasion of my mind and soul. The apparitions were not malevolent monsters in the traditional sense. They were the embodiment of grief and regret, and they knew exactly how to prey on a broken man. I continue to struggle with the haunting echoes of that night. Benji, ever my faithful companion, now senses a difference in me. He stays close, as if to guard against the shadows that I sometimes see lingering at the edges of my vision. I've tried to move on, to build a life that is not defined by fear and sorrow, but the memory of that night remains an indelible scar, a reminder that sometimes the past refuses to let go. Perhaps, in some twisted way, I am still that lost child, forever searching for the comfort of a mother's love or a father's protection that I failed to provide. And perhaps, the voices of those spectral children will always whisper in the corners of my mind, a sorrowful reminder that in places like Caddo Lake, the boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, are not as clear as we would like to believe. I survived that night, yes, but the cost was more than I could ever articulate. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside my window brings me back to the moments when the fog rolled in and the voices called my name. I now live with the quiet terror of knowing that sometimes, when the night is deep and the world is asleep, the spirits of the lost might come calling once more. And so I remain forever changed, a man who sought solace in the wild, only to find that the wild holds secrets too terrible to forget. I have learned that there are some wounds that no amount of distance or time can ever truly mend, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to whisper in the dark. That is my truth. A truth that lingers with every sigh of the wind and every flicker of a shadow. I carry it with me always, a constant reminder that in the depths of Caddo Lake's haunted bayou, the lost children still wander, waiting for the next soul to call Daddy in the dead of night. My name is Mason Ortega, and I'm 41 years old. This happened last autumn when I decided to return to my old passion of chasing ghost stories, but this time with a personal stake. I'm a former firefighter turned paranormal podcaster, and for years I've been trying to make sense of the voices and visions that haunted me after a tragic house fire that claimed the life of a young boy I couldn't save. That night, I felt that the Devil's Backbone, the infamous stretch of winding road through the Texas Hill Country near Wimberley, might finally offer me the answers I've been chasing. I pulled my retrofitted RV off a deserted trailhead along the Backbone one late afternoon. The sky was a bruised mix of purple and orange, and the limestone cliffs looming above me cast long, unsettling shadows. I had spent weeks listening to local legends and interviews, gathering clues that pointed to strange occurrences along this very road. I wasn't entirely convinced by the stories, but something about the raw, haunting landscape and my own restless memories compelled me to come here. Before settling in, I made a brief detour to a small gas station at the edge of town. The attendant, a soft-spoken woman with wary eyes, told me about a man who'd vanished in plain sight not long ago. I was refueling my truck when I saw him chatting with a stranger, she recalled, voice trembling. Then, mid-sentence, he just disappeared into a swirl of dust. Folks say it's the devil's doing out there. I thanked her and left, my mind buzzing with both skepticism and a creeping sense of foreboding. Back at the RV, I unpacked my gear, voice recorders, cameras, and an EMF detector, along with a battered old firefighter's helmet that I'd kept for years. It was a memento of my past, a reminder of a time when I had been a man who could save lives. Now, those memories fueled a desperate need for redemption and understanding. I set up camp in a clearing near a dry creek bed that hugged the side of the road, the setting sun igniting the dusty landscape with a ghostly glow. That first night was unnerving. I spent hours recording ambient sounds, hoping to capture some EVP that might confirm or debunk the legends. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant rustling of mesquite and the occasional cry of a night bird. Just past midnight, while listening intently through my headphones, I heard a voice, soft, anguished, and disturbingly familiar. "Why did you let me burn, Mason?" it whispered. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, replaying the segment again and again, desperate to believe it was merely a trick of the wind or interference on the recorder. But deep inside, I knew that voice belonged to the little boy from that terrible fire, a boy whose death I had replayed in my nightmares every single day since. The following morning brought a mix of determination and dread. I rose before dawn and reviewed the recordings, trying to filter out the noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was a summons, an accusation that I was being drawn back into that horrible memory. Dismissing my own doubts as a symptom of guilt, I decided to press on with the investigation. I drove a short distance along a rough, winding track and stumbled upon something that made my stomach churn. A dead cow, unnaturally twisted, its eyes charred into darkness. Carved into its flesh was the unmistakable shape of a three-pronged pitchfork, a mark that seemed too deliberate to be a random act of nature. I took pictures, my hands trembling, and made sure to note every detail in my journal. That afternoon, as I set up my equipment near the scene, I noticed my EMF detector begin to spike intermittently. The needle danced wildly despite the absence of any electronic interference. I set my camera to time-lapse mode and left it pointing towards a copse of gnarled trees. Hours later, when I reviewed the footage, I caught a glimpse of something I couldn't explain, a dark, indistinct figure standing motionless among the brush. When I stopped the video, the frame showed no trace of the figure, no footprints, no disturbances in the brush, just the same silent wilderness I'd seen all day. By the second night, my nerves were frayed. I had spent the day in a haze of sleep-deprived determination, editing audio and reviewing footage. I even recorded a short podcast entry, my voice tight and raw with emotion, discussing the growing evidence of something otherworldly along the backbone. But when I played it back later, all I heard was a layer of distorted screaming, like the tortured cry of a soul in anguish. I couldn't tell if the malfunction was in my equipment or if something had infected the recording with its own malevolence. I was beginning to feel as if the very road was twisting around me, warping reality. I remember that night I lay awake, in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my RV when I felt a sudden warmth on my palm. I looked down to find a burn mark, eerily shaped like a pitchfork. The pain wasn't severe, but the message was clear, a message that something in these cursed lands was marking me, as if tracking my guilt or confirming that I was meant to be here. In the depths of my troubled sleep, I dreamt again of the fire, a searing, inescapable inferno, and in that dream, the voice of the little boy said, "You know why he chose you." I awoke drenched in sweat. The image of the boy's tortured face burned into my memory. Determined to understand more, I began to explore the immediate surroundings on foot. In the hazy light of dawn, I wandered a narrow path along the roadside, following what I hoped were natural trails. The morning air was cool and still, but an undercurrent of dread made every step feel heavy. It was then that I noticed something odd. My RV door was slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it the night before. dusty boot prints led away from the door, disappearing into the tall, dry grass. I chased them at a brisk pace, my heart pounding in my ears, but they vanished, as if swallowed by the landscape. I was left standing there, confused and unsettled, with a deep sense that I wasn't alone. That evening, as the sky darkened and the eerie calm of twilight settled over the backbone, I decided to check an old, weather-beaten trail sign at the edge of the clearing. Taped to its rusted surface was a folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it, revealing a hastily scrawled note. Don't talk to the rider. Don't answer his questions. Don't make a deal. At the bottom, in shaky script, was a signature. C.A. Ortega. I stared at it, my mind reeling. That was my father's initials. A man who had vanished when I was just a teenager, leaving behind more questions than answers about our family's dark past. I'd never understood the pain of his absence until now, and the idea that he might have known something about this place sent chills down my spine. Over the next several hours, I felt increasingly torn between rational investigation and a deep-seated, instinctive dread. The air in the clearing grew thick, and I could hear the faint echo of hooves on gravel as if someone, or something, was circling the perimeter. I decided to retreat to the relative safety of the RV, but not before setting my equipment to record. Overnight, determined to capture any further anomalies. The second night unfolded in a disorienting blend of terror and surrealism. I sat in the dim light of a single lamp, listening to the hum of the EMF detector and the occasional inexplicable creaks of the RV settling in the cool night air. Suddenly, my eyes caught movement out of the corner of my vision, a dark silhouette, against the moonlit backdrop of the hills. I peered through the window and saw a figure on a pale horse, standing still as if carved from the shadows. The figure wore a wide-brimmed hat that concealed its face, and for a moment I felt a desperate, primal urge to call out. But something in the rider's silent vigil held me back. I watched in frozen horror as the phantom seemed to linger on the edge of perception, watching my every move. When dawn broke, I found the RV door wide open once again, with the same dusty boot prints leading in and out. I could no longer deny that whatever was here was watching, waiting for me to make a move. As the nights bled into each other, the line between reality and nightmare blurred further. I began experiencing disturbing hallucinations during the day. Fleeting. Glimpses of twisted roadways that writhed like living serpents, and the echo of laughter that was not entirely human, yet filled with a familiarity that tormented me. In the quiet hours before dawn, I would sometimes record a new podcast entry, my voice faltering as I recounted the surreal images and sounds, only to later discover that the playback contained no human voice at all, just a layer of garbled, almost demonic shrieks that left me questioning my sanity. On the third night, with the oppressive weight of guilt and fear pressing down on me, I resolved to confront the presence that had haunted these nights. I stepped outside the RV, the chill of the night air biting at my skin, and began walking towards the ridge where the phantom rider had been seen. The road wound steeply upward, the gravel crunching under my boots, and my heart pounded in anticipation and terror. As I climbed, the sky darkened to an inky black, and the only light came from the weak glow of a crescent moon. Every step felt like a descent into the depths of my own memories. Memories of a burning inferno and the anguished screams of a life lost. At the top of the ridge, I found a clearing that overlooked the vast, desolate expanse of the backbone. I set up my camera, my recorder, and, against every rational impulse, spoke aloud to announce my presence. "I'm here," I said, my voice echoing against the silent hills. I waited, every nerve on edge, until I finally saw movement at the far edge of the clearing. The figure emerged slowly, a cowboy on a pale horse, the man from the local legends. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his eyes, dark and fathomless, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He stepped forward, his voice measured and calm, yet carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "You want peace, son? I can give you that," he said, his tone eerily familiar, as if it were laced with both sympathy and malevolence. "I can bring the boy back. I can let you forget it ever happened." For a long, agonizing moment, time seemed to freeze. Memories of the inferno, the frantic rush to save a child, and the unending guilt that had followed me ever since surged within me. His words were like a dark promise, a Faustian bargain that dangled the possibility of redemption before my eyes. I felt an overwhelming urge to accept, to erase the pain and guilt that had defined my every waking moment since that night. The thought of hearing his laughter again, of feeling that elusive sense of closure, was almost too enticing to resist. But then, as I looked into his eyes, a reflection of my deepest fears, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the depths of his gaze, I caught a flicker of the burning child's face, distorted and tormented, pleading silently with me. The horror of it was undeniable. I staggered backward, my voice strangled in the silence that followed. The Phantom Rider's smile was slow and dreadful, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Then you get to keep it all," he intoned softly, his voice a chilling blend of compassion and cruelty. "The guilt, the fire, forever." In that instant, I realized that I had been trapped by my own memories, an endless loop of remorse and longing that I could neither escape nor amend. I turned and ran back down the ridge, my footsteps thundering in the quiet night. The echo of his final words chased me all the way back to my RV. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I fumbled with the keys to lock the door. Every shadow, every whisper of wind seemed to carry the weight of his curse. I bolted the door and collapsed into a chair, staring at the dark horizon as if expecting to see the Phantom Rider waiting just outside. Sleep did not come that night. I sat by the weak light of a desk lamp, recording my final thoughts, trying desperately to piece together the fragments of my shattered reality. I recounted every detail: the voice on the recorder, the twisted cow, the inexplicable burn mark, and the ominous note bearing my father's initials. My voice grew hoarse as I repeated the words, "I said no. I said no," over and over, as if trying to convince myself that I had made the right choice. In the early hours of dawn, I decided to take one last look at the clearing from the ridge, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could gather some evidence to explain what had happened. I stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, my breath visible in the weak light of the rising sun. The clearing was empty, the Phantom Rider nowhere to be seen, but on the ground, near where I had stood, lay a single battered leather glove, the kind I used to wear when I was a firefighter. My heart pounded as I picked it up, the realization hitting me like a freight train. That glove, a remnant of a life I'd thought was buried, was now tainted by the presence of this infernal force. It was as if the rider had taken a token, a piece of me, as a permanent reminder of my guilt and my refusal. By mid-morning, I returned to my RV and tried to gather my thoughts. I knew I had to leave before the darkness returned, before the cycle of torment could begin anew. I started the engine, the familiar hum of the motor offering a small comfort against the memories of the night. Yet, as I drove away from that cursed ridge, the backbone seemed to twist and writhe beneath the wheels. Every turn of the road felt like an invitation back into the nightmare I was desperate to escape. Hours later, my RV rolled to a stop on a deserted stretch of highway. A park ranger approached cautiously, calling out my name into the silence. But I wasn't there to greet him. Instead, the ranger found the RV running, its engine idling softly in the early morning light, and inside lay evidence of a frantic struggle. My microphone, still recording on the table, continued to play back my last words in a trembling loop. I said no. I said no. I said... The sound, distorted and echoing, filled the empty space as if my very soul was still trying to deny. The bargain I had faced. They never found me. The search party combed the surrounding areas for days, but all that remained were scattered belongings and a trail of inexplicable clues. a glove on a ridge, distorted audio recordings, and whispered legends that grew with each retelling. My story became a cautionary tale among paranormal enthusiasts and locals alike. A man who sought redemption along the devil's backbone, only to be claimed by the weight of his own guilt. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I like to think that somewhere, out there in the inky darkness of the hill country, my voice still echoes among the rustling pines. Hikers passing near the backbone swear they hear a man's voice caught on the wind, softly repeating, "I said no," as if trapped in an eternal loop of regret. And while I remain lost to those who once knew me, my final recording serves as a grim reminder. Some bargains come with a price that is too high to pay, and some voices, no matter how desperate the plea, are better left unheeded. That is my truth. A truth that lingers in every whisper of the wind and every shadow that falls across the lonely highways of Texas. I tried to outrun my past, to silence the memories with each mile I traveled. But the Devil's Backbone, with its haunting legends and spectral promises, ensured that my guilt would follow me like a relentless phantom, an eternal reminder that the fires of our regrets can never truly be extinguished.